For those who don't know me, I'm Deborah Stanhill. I'm the chair of Mayan's Emerging Scholar Fellowship Committee. Welcome to the third class of this year's Emerging Scholar Fellowship with this year's fellow, Neti Penstein. It's wonderful to see both returning students and new ones. For those of you who are new to this initiative at Mayan, this is the second year of a 3-year pilot to support early career female Torah scholars who would like to teach adult education. We do this through a stipend, mentorship and pedagogy from experienced teachers, and the opportunity to teach and put those lessons into practice. I'd like to direct you to the flyer. There's not the source sheet, but there's a second flyer, which has more information about our program on the back, as well as about our mentors. And you can also visit the Mayan website if you're interested in more information about this program. Before we start, a few thank yous. First, a big thank you to Jared and Valerie for so generously opening their home this evening. A second big thank you to Rabbi Samuels and Congregation Shari Tefillah for co-sponsoring tonight's class and providing refreshments. It is meaningful to me at Mayan that in this second year, we have shuls in the community who are eager to partner with us in this endeavor. Thank you, Talia Greenboim, Director of Education and Engagement, for everything you do for Mayan, including racing from Sharon to Newton after Shabbos. And to Lital Kaufman, Mayan's Director of Finance and Operations, both of whose work is invaluable. And to the Mayan board members, led by President Buryanovich, who helped out tonight. Dr. Tammy Jacobowitz, Neti's mentor for tonight's class, couldn't be here, but I want to recognize her work with Neti over the last few weeks as Neti prepared for this class. This fellowship is funded outside of Mayan's operating budget, so a special thank you to our foundational donors who ensured we could create this program, and to the other donors who have helped support it. Your contributions are always welcome. This is the first time we have tried this Motzei Shabbat co-ed format for this program based on feedback last year from our mentors. Feel free to let us know what you think. Now to our class. Neti's bio is also on the sheet, so feel free to find the cover sheet to find her, to see her bio. We're so excited to learn once again with you, Neti. Please come and teach us.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for coming out on a late Motzei Shabbos, the first late Motzei Shabbos, and I'm very excited to learn with everyone tonight. I just wanted to start off by asking if we could dedicate our learning here together tonight in memory of my cousin, Maoz Morel, Asham Yikum Damo. It's about to be Maoz's Shloshim. He was a part of the paratroopers brigade. He was 22 years old, and he was killed defending Israel and defending the Jewish people. And I just want to mention something that came up at Maoz's funeral that actually has to do with the lesson that I think that the korban that we're going to speak about today imparts. And one of Maoz's friends from his unit spoke about the fact that there were sort of two very different aspects to Maoz. That on the one hand, he was this strong soldier, always the one who was volunteering to hold the heavy machine gun for the unit, a job that everyone else avoided. But also in his free time, whenever he had a moment, he would sit and read and reread the Sila Yishar and one of the classics works of Musar, of ethics. And he was a very humble, learned individual that was always working on himself and his character traits. And even though these two things seem very juxtaposed, in his personality they really were kind of seamlessly integrated and incorporated. And that really struck me, and so I took it upon myself to try to learn the Sila Yisharim in memory of my cousin. And the very first attribute that is discussed in the Sila Yisharim is the attribute of Zechiras, of being a careful, mindful individual who takes all of their decisions in their life seriously. And I believe that this is part of the message of the korban that we're going to speak about tonight, the Asham Taluy. Now before I begin, I also want to give a very quick introduction. Those who have been to previous shiur have heard this, but there are obviously some new faces in this room, so I just want to preface and ask, right, why did I choose to speak about korbanos? Now, it's true that Parshat Vayikra is coming up this upcoming Shabbos, so hopefully this will give everyone a context for learning Vayikra. But I think generally this is something that people avoid or try to kind of work around speaking about. And I think there's good reasons for that. The korbanot aren't relevant to us nowadays, And there are also a lot of details, and it can get very technical and very dry very quickly. But in my senior year of college, I wrote my undergraduate thesis on one of Rav Soloveitchik's works, Halachic Mind. And the main argument that he gives in that work really changed how I approached this topic. It can be summarized if you look at the very first thing on your source sheets. His main argument in that work is really summarized in the very last line, where he says, out of the sources of halacha, a new worldview awaits formulation. And the Rav felt that even though the big ideas of Jewish philosophy seem very far removed from the question of minute technical halakhic details, you need those details in order to get to the big ideas. And when you think about what it means to bring a korban, the individual who brings a korban is essentially coming to stand before their creator. And the fact that there are different ways to do that there are different types of korbanos, tells us that there are different ways to stand before God and to express ourselves before God. So I believe that each korban has something to teach us about a different aspect of our avodas Hashem, of our service of God. And the Asham Taluy, which literally translates, Asham means a guilt offering, Taluy means uncertain. And so it's this korban that I want to explore with you. And I want to start by looking actually at the Yom Kippur davening, at something that we say in the vidoy, in the confession on Yom Kippur. And it's a line that always puzzled me, that when I read it, I never exactly knew what to have in mind or what it was addressing. And so I want to open this to all of you, to ask you. And if you take a look in source 1, right, we say in our confession on Yom Kippur, if you look at the bold, b'bli da'at, for the sins that we've committed without knowledge. And later on in the halachit, we have a similar line where we say, the sins that we committed with knowledge and without knowledge. So the question is, what are we talking about here? What are we asking God to forgive? What should we be thinking about when we say this line? Any thoughts?
Kind of assumed until now that B'li meant that you didn't know what you were doing was wrong. In that, let's say you broke Shabbos because you didn't know that this was Asar on Shabbos, and possibly what you were confessing is you maybe could have learned that it was forbidden on Shabbos if you had only put in a little bit more effort, and therefore your lack of knowledge is a kind of negligence.
Okay, awesome. So you're focusing on the b'li da'at, that is the sin. Or is that the sin, or is it the Shabbos violation?
Yes.
There are two types of unwitting. One is you don't know the halacha, and the other, like, so you don't know something you should not done. The other is I don't know what Shabbos. So perhaps that's what those two.
Interesting, and so you're also picking up on why there's two, right? Why there's the b'li das and v'yodim or b'lo yodem. Very interesting. Yeah.
But there is also very definitely a sense that even though that certain types of sins you commit them, even though you didn't know it was a sin, even though you didn't know you were doing it, nonetheless, if there's something wrong, and this is reflected, of course, in this topic, but also in the ideas of the metame ha'aretz, that the ideas of there's some sort of spiritual impurity and that you impart to the land by your sins. And it's not a question that the land did anything or that the community did it. So there are definitely notions of sin that don't fit what we normally think of as a crime.
Very interesting, right? So it's almost like it's a sin. There might not be any culpability, but nonetheless,
nonetheless, you did it, and it happened, and it changed the balance of the world in some way.
Awesome, great. Anyone else have any thoughts? Any thoughts also, could these two things be different maybe? Is there a difference between b'li das, v'yodim, u'b'lo yodem? Okay, so I think that kind of to take those 3 points all together, I think what emerges is two sort of different possibilities. I think, can you tell me your name, sorry?
Richard.
Richard. So I think Richard is focusing very much on the sin itself, right? Just the possible fact that I did a sin, that's something that I have to think about and take seriously. Whereas, remind me your name, sorry. Adam and Jeff are focusing more on the attitude of the individual that got them into the situation where they committed the sin. So, right, is bibli da'at the sin itself, or is it the frame of mind in which you were there? And I think it's this question that lies at the heart of the korban that we're going to look at tonight. And so without further ado, I guess I've been talking a lot about it, so let's read these psukim inside. And just to give a little bit of context of the structure of Sefer Vayikra, so we can appreciate, not Sefer Vayikra, Parshas Vayikra, so that we can appreciate where these psukim are coming from. The Parsha opens up with the nidava, with the free will offerings, an offering that an individual can choose to bring at any time. And then it moves on to speak about the chuva, the obligatory offerings that are generally brought in the context of a sin. So an individual commits a certain sin, and this is the offering that they have to bring. And the paradigmatic example of the chuva offerings is the chatas, right? The chatas is the sin offering. It's brought for a very specific and defined type of sin. For a sin that you do accidentally, but if you had done it on purpose, you would have been chayav kares, right? Kares is this very stringent punishment. It literally means to be cut off. And so you do this stringent sin, but you do it without intention. And then we get to Asham. And Asham is also about sin. But there, it's not really so clear what kind of sin an Asham is triggered by. It's almost like this cholent of all sorts of different things. There's 6 different types of korban Asham, and it's really hard to figure out what the unifying factor between all of them is. And the one that we're going to focus on, I think, is one of the even more mysterious ones, and that's the Asham Taluy. So if you look, the Torah begins by telling us in Pasuk Yud Zayin, Im nefesh ki tichta v'asta achra mikol mitzvot Hashem asher lo ta'asena v'lo yada v'ashim v'nasa avona. So a person who sins, who does one of the commandments about things that they should not have done, v'lo yada, and he does not know, but he is guilty, and he should be subject to punishment. And if you look in source number 3 for a moment, at the introductory pasuk that introduces us to the korban chatas, the words are almost exactly the same. It's the same language of nefesh ki tichta, the same words of mikol mitzvot Hashem asher lo ta'asena. And so this sounds almost exactly like the chatas, but the key difference is in those 2 words that are put in the middle. V'lo yada, and he did not know. And already we're getting mixed messages from this korban. Right? Did the individual do the sin? Did they ki tichta? V'lo yada. Or do they not know whether they committed a sin yet? And this ambiguity continues in the psukim, right? We say, Ve'hevi ayil tamim min hatzon v'arkacha la'asham el ha'kohen. So you should bring this unblemished ram as your korban to the kohen. V'kiper alav ha'kohen al shkagato asher shagag. V'hu lo yada v'nislach lo. Right? And the kohen will atone for him for the mistake that he made. And again, even here, during the atonement process, it again emphasizes, and he does not know, v'nislach lo, and he'll be forgiven. And then finally, in Pasuk Yud Tet, and this I think is the most mysterious of the psukim, Asham hu, Ashom Asham la'Hashem. Right, the Torah tells us, this is a korban Asham, even though we're already told in Pasuk Yud Chet that it was a korban Asham, and this individual has incurred guilt before God. And I think that here, it's almost as though the Torah is telling us, why is it called a korban Asham? It's called a korban Asham because Asham means guilt. And the individual bringing this korban, Ashom Asham la'Hashem, has been found guilty before the Lord. But what's very striking is that I mentioned that there are 5 other korbanos Asham. And all of those come for definite sins. There's no lo yada there. And yet it's only here in the context of this uncertain sin, this sin where we say lo yada, that we emphasize, re-emphasize, and then triple down and emphasize again on this word Asham, and Asham hu, Ashom, Asham la'Hashem. And so why is it here, where perhaps the least guilt is really being incurred, that we're doubling and tripling down on this language, and that we're being the most transparent of, this is why it is called a korban Asham. And so taking together all of the kind of mixed signals, I guess you could say, from the psukim as to whether there is a sin here or whether there's not a sin here, I want to look at what Chazal do, how Chazal try to figure out, okay, what situation is this korban actually coming for? And we're going to look at Rashi's explanation, because Rashi essentially provides us with sort of the classic approach to this korban in Chazal. So Rashi says, "Ha'inyan hazeh mitaber b'mi sheba safek karis liyado, v'lo yada im avar alav im lav." Rashi tells us that this korban is brought by an individual who has an experience where he encounters an uncertain violation of something that he would be chayav karis for, but he doesn't know whether he committed that sin in question. And Rashi gives us an example. Kigun chila v'shuman lefanov ukisavor sheshtein heter v'achal asachas. Right? If, for example, if this individual had before him a piece of meat that had chilav, which is the forbidden fat, it's called suet in English. We spoke about it last time at the Shlomim shiur. I mentioned that I learned what it actually was from the Great British Baking Show, where they use it in their pies. So people do eat chilav. So you have a piece of meat with chilav, and that you would get karis for eating, and a piece of meat with shuman with permitted fat. And the individual eats one of them and doesn't know which one he ate. And then amrulo achad shel chilav hayta. Right? And then someone comes in and they say one of those pieces had chilav. V'lo yada im zu shal chilav achal. And he doesn't know whether that was the one he ate. Harizeh mivi Asham Taluy, umagin alav uzman shelo yada shelo nodalo shebadai chatat. And so this individual brings an Asham Taluy, and it protects him so long as he doesn't know that he certainly sinned. And then Rashi ends by telling us ve'im nodalo achar zman yavi chatas, that if he finds out after some time that he actually did this sin, then he'll bring a korban chatas. Because we mentioned that chatas comes for accidentally doing something that would be obligated karis for. So if he finds out that he did the avira, he would then bring an additional chatas. Now, to me, Rashi is presenting this in a certain way, but I think it leaves a lot of holes open. Because Rashi is creating this one story, right, where the individual doesn't know whether they sinned. In the meantime, they're bringing this Asham Taluy. They find out that they sinned. That's kind of like their placeholder korban. Then they find out that they sinned. Now they do the real deal. They bring the chatas. But what Rashi doesn't tell us about is what happens in a situation where the individual actually didn't sin, where they find out that the piece that they ate was a totally kosher piece of meat, and they haven't done anything wrong. And how should that individual now think about the korban that they brought, right? They brought this Asham Taluy, but what does it all mean if they haven't even done the sin? And Rashi sort of gives us this one view where Asham Taluy is this placeholder before the chatas, but he doesn't explain to us how Asham Taluy works and what its meaning is when there is no korban chatas in the picture. And I think that especially when we look at it this way, right, when the focus is on the possible sin committed, the way that Richard was explaining Biblidas to us, we start to really wonder, how could the Torah be so, judgmental of this individual and say, Asham hu Ashom Asham Hashem, when we don't even know whether there was a sin committed? So I want to look for a moment at a comment of Sforno, because I think that the Sforno tries to address that question of why we have this phrase of Asham hu Ashom Asham Hashem, and along the way, he talks about the case that Rashi didn't mention, the case where the individual actually didn't sin, and how they look at their korban in that case. So the Sforno says, why do we tell you, again, Asham hu? Because afal pi shelefamim yuva zeh hakorban v'hu lo nichshal v'oso hachi. Says the Sforno, because even though sometimes this korban will be brought, and we'll find out that the individual didn't actually mess up and commit this sin, lo yichshov hachoshiv shemachnis bezeh chulin la'azara. This individual shouldn't now think, I didn't do an avira, the korban that I brought, it wasn't a real korban, it was for naught, it was worthless. Why? Ki amnam hu korban asham al kol panim. Right, the Torah is telling you, no matter what you find out later, this was still a korban asham regardless. Even if you didn't actually commit the sin in question. V'hatam hu ki ashom asham l'Hashem kishalom nizhar b'davar ad shenafal b'safek. And the reason that this korban still has meaning, even if you didn't do the sin, is because the guilt that you incurred is the fact that you weren't careful, that you got yourself into a situation where you have doubt. That when someone comes in and tells you, one of those pieces was a bad one, you're not even sure which one you ate. And now you're having this experience where you don't know whether or not you've committed this very serious and egregious avera.
So is it almost better to know and then you only bring one korban? If you don't know, it's like you bring two. That seems...
Exactly, excellent. And we're gonna really get to that in the next source, because it does seem like that, right? The individual that doesn't know has this extra step that they have to go through, which is essentially what the Asham Taluy is. It's this extra korban that they have to bring, and then once they know, then they bring the next korban. Exactly. And so I think that we can kind of take Rashi and Sforno's emphases, and I made a chart for a very small chart, but a chart nonetheless, as two different ways of understanding what this korban is all about. And I think it really hits on the two different explanations that we discussed earlier of the Yom Kippur Vidoy. Right? Is it about the possible sin committed, what Richard was suggesting, or is it about the doubt itself? Right? When Adam and Jeff were suggesting about the very fact that you're in doubt, that in of itself is a problem.
I think Swan is asking a very profound question also, saying you're giving the Asham Taluy as a sapek card, but you also, by doing that, there's now, theoretically, there's maybe a sapek card being pulled in the Zar.
Yeah. You're not better off if it's not
So there's some
oh no, it was even worse.
Excellent. So I'm just going to explain that comment, right? What Jeff is pointing out is that the idea of bringing something that's a non-sanctified animal into the Beis Hamikdash, that itself is a karis violation. And if there was no purpose for this korban, then, right, Jeff is saying, then you actually violated an isser karis, a prohibition that you would have received karis for, which is worse. And what's actually very striking is that the Gemara in Nazir views this korban as something that really would be chulin la'azara, it really would be an unneeded korban, if not for the fact that the Torah tells us we'll waive that prohibition in this case. Which I think is shocking, right? It's a shocking way to think about a korban that's being brought for karis to, in and of itself, sort of almost be violating that prohibition.
My name is Sarah. I think everybody has to do this korban, because if you don't know that you committed a sin, that's every...
Okay, hold on to that because we're gonna get there. Amazing.
Right.
Yeah, hold on to that thought. You're gonna like one of the Tanaim a lot. Any other questions? So this kind of question of whether the Asham Taluy is focused on the sin or the doubt itself, I want to really try to develop these two different approaches. But before I do that, I just want to add one more question to the mix that I think both explanations will really have to deal with. And that's the fact that we mentioned that both chatas and asham are korbanos that come for sin. But there's one sort of detail that's different between the chatas and asham that gets a lot of attention in Chazal. And that's the fact that the psukim tell us that an asham has to cost a minimum amount of money. You have to spend at least 2 shkalim to purchase your asham, which is not true for a chatas. You can buy the cheapest animal possible and bring that as a chatas, and that will suffice. And the Medrash in source number 6 wants to understand, is that requirement of 2 shkalim, is that true for all ashamos, even the Asham Taluy? Right? Maybe, says the Medrash, we would think that, okay, that stringency can exist for the other korbanos asham, but it wouldn't exist for the Asham Taluy. And what's the logic to that? So if you look at the underline part of the Medrash, right, the Medrash says, Ima lo yehi spiko chamor mivada. Right? We should say that the uncertain violation, how could it be treated more stringently than the certain violation? And ma vada'o chatas bas darka, spiko nami asham bas darka. And just as, right, the certain violation, you can bring a chatas that's worth, 1 coin, so too for the suffix. You should be able to bring the same lower quality animal. And the fact that we don't say that, the fact that we say no, nonetheless, the Asham Taluy still has this stringent requirement is something that I think we have to explain. So the question of whether the Asham Taluy is about the doubt or the sin, we'll use that shorthand, is debated, I think, in the Mishnah in source number 7. The Mishnah gives us a case that I think is an excellent test case to figure out what's at the heart of the korban. Because the Mishnah asks the question, let's say you have an individual who, finds out that they might have committed this Isser Kares, and they have their Asham Taluy, they're bringing this animal on their rope, walking up the steps of Har HaBayis, ready to bring it as a korban, and all of a sudden, someone runs over to them and tells them, wait, you don't need to bring that korban, you didn't do the Vayikra. So what now, They have this korban in front of them, what happens to this korban? And I think the more that you think that the Asham Taluy is about the sin, the more you're going to think that this korban doesn't really mean anything anymore now that you found out that there is no sin. So let's take a look at what these question?
I just want to ask to clarify. You're asking if someone specifically said, oh, you didn't do the sin? Or someone, regardless of what they said, they've resolved the debt?
Amazing question. So the Mishnah discusses a case where someone tells you that you didn't do the sin. The Gemara actually clarifies that the same would be true if someone told you that you did do the sin and now you have to bring a chatas. So it's in either cases, the doubt is resolved. But this is just a specific version of that, but a great question. So the Mishnah says, Hamivi Asham Taluy, v'noda lo shelo chatat. So if you bring your Asham Taluy and you find out that you didn't sin, im ad shelo nishcha. So if you haven't yet started to slaughter the animal, yitzei v'yira'eh be'eder, divrei Rabbi Meir. So the first view is the view of Rabbi Meir, where Rabbi Meir simply says, allow this animal to go out in the pasture, let it join the other animals. It doesn't even have any sanctity anymore. It's not a korban, it's just a normal animal now. And we're going to skip the chachamim for a moment. We're going to come back to them in just a moment. But there's another sort of view on the opposite extreme. Rabbi Meir says this is just a normal animal, doesn't even have any kedusha. And Rabbi Eliezer, Omer, yikarev. Rabbi Eliezer says the opposite. No, bring this korban, and don't worry about the fact that you didn't actually commit that sin. Shem ino ba'al chit zeh, harehu ba'al chit acher. I think this was what Sarah was saying, right? If it doesn't come for this sin, okay, you probably have something, doubtful that you did. You can bring this korban. And so those are the two extremes. And then in the middle, we have the view of the chachamim, where the chachamim essentially say that you do the procedure that you would do on any korban that still has its sanctity, but that can no longer be brought. So the procedure the Chachamim say is Yira'eh ad sheyistayiv v'yimaker v'yiplu damav l'nedava. That you allow the animal to pasture, but you wait for it to develop a blemish. Because only when the animal has a blemish and can no longer actually be brought on the mizbeach can you then redeem it, transfer its sanctity to money, and then you use that money to purchase other korbanim. So essentially, it seems, if we had to kind of group the chachamim, are they more similar to Rabbi Meir, or are they more similar to Rabbi Eliezer? What would anyone want to shout out their thoughts? Right, the chachamim say, don't bring it, wait for it to get a mum, and then you can redeem it.
It's more like Rabbi Eliezer, because Rabbi Meir's idea is that there's no sanctity in this korban at all. Chachamim say there is some sanctity in it because you're going to have to do something about it.
Awesome. Okay, great. Anyone disagree? Any of the opposite side? We're going to consider both possibilities. So, yeah.
I mean, you could really argue, I'm not saying bring it because it could be for another sin. Really, none of them are saying this sin should be brought for. But really are saying it does not lose its sanctity. Even though you can no longer bring it, it was not a conditionally sanctified korban. It's not retroactively unsanctified. It's just no longer possible. But I think you could argue that if it still has that you could say that if it's conditional sanctity, then you really have to argue when we were saying it was never sanctified to begin with, and you just found it out. Possibly, maybe you could argue otherwise. But I don't know. I think if the sanctity is still there, then it's always, if it was sanctified, it is sanctified.
Okay, we're going to see some of that in the Gemara in just a moment. Yeah.
I think they're more like Rabbi Meir.
Yes.
You don't have to bring the korban but we've already sanctified it, so we have a technical problem, so this is the technical solution.
Exactly, yeah. So that is how we're gonna, simple, right? We're gonna get back to what you said, because I think it's another way of understanding the Chachamim, but the way that, I think the straightforward way that the Gemara seems to understand the Chachamim is as a variation of Rabbi Meir, right? Both the Chachamim and Rabbi Meir, they agree that you can't bring this korban. There's just this technicality for the Chachamim where the sanctity is still there. We'll explore why it's still there in just a moment, and so you have to go through this procedure of redeeming it. Right, so the Gemara tells us, b'mai pliki, right? What do Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim disagree about? The Gemara says, Rabbi Meir sover, savar, kivan de lo tzarich lei lo makdish lei. That Rabbi Meir thinks that, and this is, I think, what you were saying, Adam, about the conditional sanctity, that if the individual realizes that they don't need the korban at all, then it loses its sanctity, because in their minds, when they were sanctifying the korban, they were sanctifying it only if they actually needed it, if they actually had committed a sin and they needed to bring this korban. And so the moment that they find out that they didn't commit the sin, even the very sanctity of the korban was conditional from the beginning, and that goes away. Which to me is like a very striking thing, because when you read Sefer Vayikra, the idea of the sanctity of korbanos is taken so seriously, and the fact that there can be a korban in our system that really has this completely conditional sanctity, I think it takes the Taluy, the hingingness of the Asham Taluy in the most extreme direction. And the Gemara explains, right, that for the Chachamim, right, what do the Chachamim think? So the Chachamim just disagree with Rabbi Meir about the state of mind of the individual, right? They say, mitoch shelibo nokfo gomer umakdesh. That because this individual, right, this phrase libo nokfo is very interesting. It literally means like his heart is pounding. He's really affected by the weight and the gravitas of this situation, and therefore he does imbue the korban with full sanctity. He wants to bring it, he's committed to bringing it, and because that's his state of mind, the kedusha doesn't just go away. You have to actually redeem the korban. So assuming that that's the case, and assuming that Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim kind of agree, for the most part, that the korban is about the possibility of the sin, and then they just have a slight disagreement about the individual's state of mind, how do we answer the question of the stringency of this korban? Right? If it's just about a possibility, why is it that it's treated more stringently than the korban chatas, which is about something definite? Right? The phrase of the Medrash, lo yehi sfiko chamor mivada'o, kind of screams out at us. And I think the answer to this question, or I don't think, but an answer given to this question by the Ramban as well as by his student Rabbeinu Yonah is actually very similar to something that Richard said in the beginning. And I actually brought this answer for you, not from the Ramban or the Rabbeinu Yonah, but from the Ramah, who brings it in the Shulchan Aruch. And the reason that I did that was because I found it very striking, right? We spoke in the introduction to the shiur about how we can take these details of korbanos and learn out much broader points about religious life in general. And that's exactly what the Ramah does. In talking about the proper way to do teshuvah, to repent for one's sins, he brings up the fact, the price of the Asham Taluy, as sort of a point to teach us a lesson about teshuvah. So I thought that that was, really striking and something worth bringing. So the Ramah says it as follows. He says, Yish l'chol adam l'chapis u'lepashpish b'masav v'lashuv mehem b'asar simei tshuva. That during the 10 days of repentance, the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the individual should search through and look into his actions, and he should repent from them. V'safik avira sarich yoser tshuva me'avira v'adai. And he says that an uncertain avira actually requires more repentance than a certain avira. And notice, right, that he doesn't say that it requires more atonement, right, that you did something more wrong, but rather more repentance. That at a psychological level, when you're trying to repent, you have to work harder and put more effort when it comes to these uncertain sins. And this is a psychological truth, he says. Ki yoter mecharit k'sheyodea sha'asa mi she'eno yodea. Because an individual just feels more regret and remorse when they know that they did something versus when they're not even sure whether they did something in the first place. V'lachin korban asham taluy hutrach lios yoter biyokar michatas. He says that is the reason why the Asham Taluy is more expensive and costs more than the chatas. Because essentially the Torah understands that it's going to take more out of you, and so it's giving you a harder task so that you'll put more effort into it and give this the effort that it deserves. And when I was reading this Rama, I was trying to kind of think about a way to make it personal. It seems like sort of abstract, like what does it mean to have a suffix avera, an uncertain sin? And the thing that I thought of for myself, and this is just speaking personally, is times when I've finished davening and I'm kind of like, did I say the words? Like, if I have to say Yalav Yavo, sometimes I can't even remember if I said Yalav Yavo, and then I'm like, what does that tell me about how I davened? And I think that what the Ramah is saying is that in those moments, it's sort of easy to be like, I davened. But sometimes we have to say, it might have been that I didn't daven, that I was in shul, but I didn't say those words. And it's harder psychologically to kind of feel that regret and remorse. But I think that the point that Richard made is exactly the reason why we should, right? The perspective that the Ramah is giving us, right, is that these things matter at a metaphysical level, right? It matters whether we pray, and whether we do more mitzvos versus whether we do more averos. It matters for ourselves, and it also matters in some kind of bigger global sense to the state of the world. The world is a better place when we do more good things, and we should take that seriously. So I think that that's a way to kind of fit Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim's approach within the broader framework of the Asham Taluy. And that being said, I want to turn now to Rabbi Eliezer. Right? We said that Rabbi Eliezer is kind of on the opposite extreme. Rabbi Eliezer says that the korban can still be brought, right? Because if it's not brought for the sin, then maybe it'll be brought for another sin. And Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is actually even more extreme than that. The Gemara clarifies that when Rabbi Eliezer is saying, you need another sin, he doesn't actually mean that you need another sin. Rabbi Eliezer thinks, the Gemara tells us, that regardless of whether you can even think of a possible sin, you can still bring an Asham Taluy. And that's in source number 9. It's his view, his full view is expressed in the Mishnah in source number 9, where it says Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Misnadin Adam Asham Taluy, B'kol Yom U'B'kol Eid Sheyirtzah. And this, I think, is what Sarah was saying, right? That Rabbi Eliezer says an individual can voluntarily bring an Asham Taluy on any day and at any time that he chooses. And he says, Hu haya nikra Asham Chasideh. That this type of voluntary Asham Taluy was known as the Asham of the pious, of the Chasideh. Now this is a complete revolution in this topic. If you look back at the psukim, right, in source number 2, I don't see anything to indicate that this is a voluntary korban. Right? The psukim are very clear. Im nefesh ki tichtah. If you do this sin, then you bring this korban. And as I mentioned, right, the structure of Parshas Vayikra is also very clear. We start with the voluntary korbanot, and then we go into the obligatory korbanot. And Asham Taluy is part of that framework. And so where does Rabbi Eliezer see this idea that Asham Taluy can be a voluntary korban? Where does he get it from? Right, if you look actually in the Gemara, continuing in source number 9, right, we'll read Rabbi Eliezer's view in a second, but the Chachamim say to Rabbi Eliezer, back to him, you have your categories mixed up, right? They say, Ola v'shlamim tu da'atu b'neder u'nitava, aval chatas v'asham hu v'neder. Right there, we know which korban was come as voluntary offerings. That's the Ola v'shlamim. But the chatas and the asham, those are obligatory offerings. So where is Rabbi Eliezer coming from? What did he see in the Asham Taluy? So, sorry, this is the very start of the Gemara. The Gemara asks, my time at Rabbi Eliezer, what's the logic for Rabbi Eliezer? Rabbi Eliezer says very simply, if you think that this is an obligatory offering, then it should work to offer you atonement for the sin that you committed. But if that's true, then why is it that when you find out that you did commit the sin, you actually have to bring a korban chatas? Doesn't the fact that you bring a korban chatas afterwards show us that the Asham Taluy didn't really bring you any kind of kapara or atonement? And if it isn't geared to a specific type of kapara or atonement, says Rabbi Eliezer, Ella shma mina b'davahi. It must be that this is a voluntary offering. And so what would that mean for the Asham Taluy to be a voluntary offering? The voluntary offerings are generally things that are ways of expressing something that we want to express to God, right? Or they expressing our thanks to God or our devotion to God. And so perhaps for Rabbi Eliezer, the Asham Taluy is a way to express our commitment to God and our desire to be very mindful servants of God, right? I spoke about the Mesilas Yesharim's discussion of zehiras, of being individuals who care about every action that we do and think about the words that we say and take those possibilities seriously. And perhaps, when you get this sense of, I feel like I haven't been living my life in that way, and you want to rededicate yourself and show, you don't have a specific sin in mind, you just kind of want to show your rededication, that would be what the Asham Taluy would be for Rabbi Eliezer. That's his version of Asham Chasidim, as he calls it. And the Mishnah goes on in source number 9 to really kind of dramatize this possibility that Rabbi Eliezer speaks of. Because it tells us, this is in the 3rd line in the Mishnah, Amru alav al baba ben Muta, shehaya misnadi v'asham taluy b'kol yom. They said about this individual, Baba ben Muta, that every single day of his life, he would bring an Asham Taluy. Chutz me'achar Yom HaKippurim Yom Echad. Except for the day after Yom Kippur. And he tells them that this isn't actually voluntary. Amar ha'ma'on hazeh ilu hayisi hayu me'nichem li hayisi me'vi. Says if the rabbis let me, I would have even brought an Asham Taluy the day after Yom Kippur. Ela omrim li himtein ad shetikanes lebeis hasafek. But they tell me, just wait a little bit. You just got your atonement on Yom Kippur. Wait to at least find one sort of safek that you can bring this Asham Taluy for. Sorry. And so we see, right, that kind of the extreme desire, or the extreme piety of the Baba ben Buta as an individual, that he wanted to take advantage, right, quite literally of what Rabbi Eliezer said, that you can bring this v'kol yom v'kol eight she'yirtzeh. And so if you look in the next chart below, I kind of just lined up for you these opinions of the Tanaim with the 2 possibilities that we said. Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim focus on making this all about the possible sin, and Rabbi Eliezer focuses on making this about the doubt itself, and then goes one step further to say it doesn't even need to be a doubt tied to sin. Just the fact that you feel like you could have been better, that's enough to bring the Asham Taluy. But what I want to do now is to turn to the possibility that Sybil mentioned earlier, the other way of explaining the Chachamim. Because I think that it's possible to say that the Chachamim also agree with Rabbi Eliezer that the Asham Taluy is about the doubt, and it's not about the sin. And the reason why I think this is an important model to consider is because some of you might be feeling, that you're uncomfortable with the model that Rabbi Eliezer is presenting. Right? There might be something about the fact that an individual can bring an Asham Taluy every day that feels like it promotes a sense of feeling an inadequacy, right? Feeling like you're always failing, like you always have to think sort of obsessively about what you could have done better. And so perhaps the Chachamim have a model for us that can focus more on this doubt and more on the religious, emotional state of the individual, but without going as far as Rabbi Eliezer. And so what I want to do now is try to explore that possibility. And so to just review what we know about the Chachamim, right, what we have to work with. We know that the Chachamim think, unlike Rabbi Eliezer, that this is an obligatory korban, that you can only bring it when you have a doubt about an Isser Kares, something that you would have otherwise been Chayav Kares for. And we also know that they think that the Asham Taluy has complete Kedusha, right? That the Kedusha doesn't go away even when you've sinned. And already there, we can start to see a way of understanding them differently. Because we noted, right, that the way that the Chachamim describe why it has complete Kedusha is because they say, Mituch shelibo nukvo gomer umakdesh. That because the individual who's bringing the Asham Taluy has this, inner sense of his heart pounding, is feeling the weight of what he did, it imbues the korban with sanctity. And maybe that's not just a technical disagreement with Rabbi Meir about the state of mind of the individual. Maybe that tells us something about what the korban is all about. the korban is all about libo nokva. And I want to look at a certain detail that the Amoraim, the later rabbis in the Gemara, add to the Chachamim's view that I think really tells us that the Chachamim can't really be focusing on the idea that it's about the possible sin committed. Because the Gemara in source number 10 adds a distinction into what kind of suffix you bring the korban for. It tells us, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav, Hayu lefanav shtei chatichos, achas shel chilad v'achas shel shuman. So this is the case that we know and love from Rashi, right? The case of the two pieces of meat, one with chilad and one with shuman. V'achal achas mehen, v'ina yodea iza mehen achal, chayav. Right? He eats one of them, he doesn't know which one he eats, he's obligated to bring a korban. This is what we know, this is what Rashi told us. But then, Rav says, in a case where you have chaticha, safek shel chilad, safek shel shuman, v'achla, if you have one piece of meat, but it has the same doubt, there's a 50-50 chance that it's chilad or shuman, so it's the same exact odds and the same type of doubt, and we would expect that in that case you would also bring an Asham Taluy, but says Rav, in that case, pater. In that case, where there's only one item before the individual, and it's has a doubtful status, you actually don't have to bring the Asham Taluy. So if we think about this from a statistical perspective, it makes no sense. In both cases, there's a 50% chance that you sinned and a 50% chance that you didn't sin. What's the difference from that perspective? There's no difference. Why do we make this distinction? But I think if you think about it from the perspective of the experience of the individual and the way in which he feels his religious doubt, we might start to understand what the difference might be. And the Gemara, in trying to understand Rav's distinction, right, gives us something to work with. Amar Rav Nachman, my time as a Rav, right? Rav Nachman says, what's the reason of Rav? Why does he think the Chachamim's view is limited in this way? And he explains, Kasavar, shtei chatichos ikva isura, chaticha achas lo kava isura. That when there are two pieces in front of you, and one of them is chilev, there's a set prohibition in place. It's ikva. We know for a fact that there was an isur kares in front of this individual. But when there's only one piece, it could be that there was absolutely no isur kares in the whole story. You never got near chilev in your entire life. And so why does that make a difference? So I think from maybe an objective perspective, if we're kind of looking at the situation, right, it seems to be more problematic that you're sitting at this table, right, and your hand is reaching for one piece and it's so close to reaching for that piece of meat that's actually an isur kares. And I think also from a subjective perspective, right, we can understand why an individual would feel the weight of the doubt much more if they find out that right in front of them was sitting this piece of meat with chilev in it. It just feels weightier in that case than when they find out, there's a 50% chance that was bought from, the non-kosher store or whatever the case may be. And I think we also might feel as though there's something more flawed in this individual that got themselves into this situation with the shtei chatichos. Right? Who finds themselves in that kind of situation where they're so close to this isur? And I think that this tells us that for the Chachamim, the individual that's bringing the Asham Taluy is an individual who's sort of been apathetic to a certain extent in their religious life. And this is a very dangerous thing, right? Because if we don't pay attention to the things that we're doing, then it's very easy to avoid taking responsibility and ownership for our spiritual lives. And I think that a carefree existence really is fundamentally incompatible with what it means to kind of live our lives in the presence and constant presence of God. There's a phrase that Rav Aaron Lichtenstein liked to quote from Milton, where Milton says that one should live as ever in my great taskmaster's eye. And it seems that this individual, in this shtei chatichos case, is sort of living the exact opposite kind of life. And I think that we can say that for the Chachamim, the focus is on the doubt itself. And the korban is meant to address you in this state of doubt and the apathy that brought you to this state. But unlike Rabbi Eliezer, the Chachamim are not willing to say that any kind of feeling of doubt or inadequacy warrants a korban. You can't just bring it, when you want to. It has to be the sort of doubt that really signifies some deeper religious flaw, some really deep sense of religious apathy. And that's why it has to be an avira that you would have otherwise gotten karis for. And that's why it has to be ikba isura. It has to be a time when you're in close contact with the iser. And I think we can appreciate now really what the Chachamim are saying. When you have this Asham Taluy and you find out that you didn't sin, we can understand why, since you no longer are in this state of religious doubt, you can't bring the korban. But the korban is still a korban. It doesn't just go away. Because your libo nokfo, your feelings of the gravity of the situation, imbued it with the sanctity that it had. And I think that this understanding of the Chachamim is actually how the Sefer HaChinuch, while he doesn't say it explicitly, I think it's how the Sefer HaChinuch took the Chachamim. And I want to read how the Sefer HaChinuch presents the Chachamim, because I think it will sort of tie together some of the things that we spoke about. So skipping the next Gemara and going to the Sefer HaChinuch, right? The first thing to notice is just the fact that the Sefer HaChinuch describes this korban in the way that the Chachamim do. So it's clear that he thinks, this is the proper understanding of the korban. It's for a safek iser kares, and it's for a case of shtei chatichos, of 2 pieces. And he explains how when you find out that you committed the avira, then you actually have to bring a korban chatas. But in the bolded part, he addresses the other case. What happens if you find out that you didn't do the avira? And we noted earlier that this is the case that Rashi omits, that he doesn't tell us about. But the Sefer HaChinuch does, and he says, Im noda ilav shehaheter achal, hari nigla lo, shaharishon hispik lo, ve'ino tzarech od l'korban acher acharav. If you find out that you didn't sin, now you know that this korban was sufficient for you, and you don't need to bring another korban. Now, if this was all just about the possibility of sinning, then what does he mean when he says, this korban is enough for you? If you didn't do a sin, what do I need any korban for whatsoever? Why would I even think that I have to bring a korban afterwards? So I think it's clear that the Sefer HaChinuch thinks that for the Chachamim, the Asham Taluy is addressing the doubt. And the point is that if there wasn't also a sin that followed, then this korban on his own is indeed enough to address that doubt. And he goes on in his explanation of the mitzvah to express this idea that the mitzvah is about reminding us to be careful and more mindful in our religious lives. And he says something in presenting that point that is very striking. In the continuing bolding, he says, "V'haraya she'inenu ba'arak l'chaper alatzluto b'kach." The proof, he says, that this only comes to atone for, right, he uses the word atzluto, meaning one's laziness in his religious life, because it doesn't offer any atonement for the sin at all. Because when you find out that you sinned, you immediately have to bring another korban, just as you would have been obligated to do had you not brought the Asham Taluy. Now, we've heard this line of reasoning before. Right? We heard this logic before about the fact that you have to bring a chatas shows us that the Asham Taluy wasn't giving you any kapara. But who did we hear this line from? It wasn't from the Chachamim. It was from, it was from Rabbi Eliezer, who the Chachamim were arguing with. This was Rabbi Eliezer's logic as to why this is an adava, why this is a free will offering. And so how can the Sefer HaChinuch, in trying to explain the Chachamim's view, just kind of slip in the logic of Rabbi Eliezer? It doesn't seem to make sense. And so I think that perhaps the Chachamim really do, to a large extent, agree with Rabbi Eliezer about this logic. But they don't understand the atonement in the same way that Rabbi Eliezer does. Rabbi Eliezer says, if it's not atoning for the possible sin, it's not atoning at all. And so therefore it can just be a free will offering. But the Chachamim say, no, you're right, it is not atoning for the sin. That's what the chatas is going to do. But it is atoning for something. It's atoning for the individual's state of doubt. the religious personality of this individual who has shown their apathy and their lack of carefulness in their avodah Hashem. And that's what the korban is coming for. And that's, in the Chachamim's reply to Rabbi Eliezer, they say to him, no, the Asham Taluy comes lahagin alav, to protect him, to protect this individual. And I think that this idea that the Asham Taluy doesn't necessarily address the sin, but addresses the individual more broadly, their attributes, can explain to us a Mishnah that's quoted by the Gemara in source number 12, where the Mishnah tells us that chayavei chataos v'ashamos v'doen sha'avar aleim yom ha'kippurim chayavin lahavi la'achar yom ha'kippurim. That someone who is obligated to bring a korban chatas or a regular korban asham, and Yom Kippur passes before they do so, they still have to bring it after Yom Kippur. Because the fact that they had this avera obligated that korban, and that doesn't go away even after Yom Kippur. But when it comes to chayavei ashamos tluyin, when it comes to an individual who's obligated to bring an Asham Taluy, but then Yom Kippur passes, p'turen, they're exempt from bringing anything else. And perhaps this is because Yom Kippur is the day where we do what the Asham Taluy is trying to get us to do, where we don't live carelessly, and when we take a moment to be careful, to go through all of our actions, and to really think and do a cheshbon hanefesh. And Yom Kippur atones for us in the broader sense, atones for the people that we are. And so therefore, after Yom Kippur, you don't need an Asham Taluy. And I just want to mention, before we close, for those who were at the Korban Ola shiur, the very first year, you might be thinking that in a certain sense, this kind of seems similar to the Korban Ola, because there too we spoke about the fact that the Korban Ola can atone more broadly for the individual. And I was really excited to find this comment of the Ramban, which on the face of it, seems sort of wild, but makes sense once you understand the korbanos this way. Where in source number 14, the Ramban explains that the reason that the Asham comes from a male animal rather than a female animal, even though the chatas, which is also for sin, comes from a female animal, is because he says the Asham has to be a male animal because an Ola is a male animal. And to a certain extent, he says it's as though the Asham is like an Ola. It has a similar quality to an Ola. And if you read that, and you're just reading through Sefer Vayikra, think, what is this talking about? What do they have to do with each other? Right? One is obligatory, one is voluntary. But for those that were at that year and at this one, I just thought it was really fascinating to see that connection can make some sort of sense. So I want to just pause for a moment to take questions before I kind of summarize and wrap things up. So does anyone have any questions? Yes.
If the Asham is then meant to atone specifically for the doubt itself, and not for the sin that you may have committed or may not have committed, why then, if you find out that you did or did not commit the sin while you're at the Beit HaMikdash with your Asham, do you not say, great, I will bring it not according to Linzer for a different sin, or but for that, your doubt got resolved, but you were still in a case of doubt.
Yeah.
So why not bring it for that sin? How did you solve your problem?
Yeah, so it's a great question. If you look at the Gemara focuses on the fact that the Sukkim put the phrase "v'lo yada" v'nislach lo next to each other, that they say he didn't know and he achieves atonement. And I think that this idea makes sense, that the Gemara says that in order to achieve the atonement of the Asham Taluy, for your doubt, you have to be in that state of doubt. That it sort of can only address the individual in that state. And there are other ways, as we saw, right, Yom Kippur, there's other types of teshuvah that the individual can obviously do for these attributes. But in terms of the obligation to bring a korban for it, that obligation only comes when you're in that state of doubt.
So are you better off, so if the person resolves your doubt before you can bring it, are you better off in that you don't need to bring a korban, or are you worse off in that you cannot bring the korban?
Kind of depends on your perspective. Yeah, it's definitely an individual kind of preference, I think. Okay, so just to kind of take the three different approaches that we saw to the Asham Taluy, right? We saw Rabbi Meir's approach, which really was focused on taking seriously the effects that our actions have on ourselves and on the world more broadly, even when we didn't necessarily do anything wrong and we're not culpable for them in the traditional sense. And we saw Rabbi Eliezer, who made this korban all about expressing our desire to be more mindful and more careful, servants of God. And then finally, we saw the chachamim, who make the korban not about addressing an action that you did wrong, but a general religious state, one of religious apathy that you need to fix and the effects that that state can have on the individual. And I just want to close by reading something from Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, where he writes about a specific type of teshuvah that he calls not a teshuvah of repentance, which focuses on sin, but a teshuvah of return, which focuses more broadly on the individual's relationship to Hashem. And I think that this type of teshuvah that he describes really encapsulates to a certain extent what the Asham Taluy is all about, and gives us a way to think about and bring it into our lives even without the institution being practically relevant. So if you look in the bolded part, right, the Rav Aaron explains that this idea is not teshuvah in relation to sin, but teshuvah in response to a life which is insensitive to sin. Right, the individual that finds themselves in this situation with the two pieces before them and doesn't even know what they did in that situation. And he goes on to say that God and one's relation to him are not at the focal point of one's life, at the epicenter of his being, but are at most a kind of peripheral presence, a set of parameters defining one's being. To the extent that one has awareness of having sinned, it's not the sin of direct affront or confrontation, but rather the sin of apathy, of indifference, of simply failing to relate, of averting one's gaze from God and focusing instead upon alternative concerns. To the extent that there is sin here, it is the sin of shichacha, forgetting. And to put it in our terms, we can say it is the sin of the lo yada, of lack of awareness. Thank you so much, everyone.